Self-myofascial release for your thighs. Let's get it. What's up, everybody? Coach Zach here, and in this video, we're talking about how you can do self-myofascial release on your own thighs. Now, I cover in detail what myofascial release is in the first video in this series. If you haven't seen that, check it out right here. But this video is going to be much more detailed on specifically targeting your thighs. Before we get into the techniques, there are some points that I want to make regarding whether you need to work more on your quads or your hamstrings. The muscles of your thighs directly affect what's going on at the hip. So if you take a look at your hips, you can do this in the mirror, you can do a sideways view, and just take a look at how your hips naturally are. So we got what's called an anterior pelvic tilt and a posterior pelvic tilt. So if you think about an anterior pelvic tilt, where you have a little bit of an arch in your lumbar spine and you're kind of sticking your butt out in this way, when your hips are in this position naturally, you want to focus more on your quads. Specifically, you have a quad called your rectus femoris, which connects from your hip to your knee. So if this muscle is concentrically tight, what it's going to do, it's going to pull the front of your hips forward, which is going to stick your butt back, and you're going to be stuck in this anterior pelvic tilt. Take a look at your hip and your knee, bring these 2 points closer together, and you're in that anterior pelvic tilt. So if you're in this position, you want to target more your quads. If you're in a posterior pelvic tilt, where you're kind of tucking your tailbone between your legs, thrusting your hips forward, getting rid of the arch in your lumbar spine, this is your natural position, then you want to focus more on your hamstrings. Your hamstrings connect right from your sitting bones, your ischial tuberosity, down to your knee. So what happens if you bring these 2 points closer together? You're going to be stuck in that posterior pelvic tilt. So to summarize, if you're stuck in this anterior pelvic tilt, get your quads more. If you're in that posterior pelvic tilt, hamstrings. The first muscle we're going to get into is rectus femoris. Rectus femoris is the only quad muscle that runs from your knee all the way up to your hip. Right? It's like right in the middle of your thigh. So you're going to be hitting this spot right here. Now the tools you can use for this one is, I really love using a hard medicine ball, but if you have a foam roller with some texture, right? I spoke about this in the video describing self-myofascial release, you can use that. So if you're going to use the foam roller, then you would lay on top of it. I like to have the other leg bent out to the side, and use your arms and use your leg and use your foot to determine how much pressure you're putting into the roller, the ball, the crossball, whatever it is. So the more you put into your arms and your leg, the less pressure it is. You can change the intensity, right? So I'm gonna use this ball right here because it gets a little bit deeper into it. And for this, you wanna have the leg bent, right? We wanna bring some movement once we find those tender spots to really help open up the fascia. So go ahead and search around. What we don't wanna do is just roll back and forth. We're not doing anything here. We're just moving fluids back and forth. It's not what we want, right? You just wanna search. You want to keep your toes pointing down because we don't want to be on the inside of the thigh, and we don't want to be in the outside of the thigh. We want to be right in the center of the thigh. Go ahead and search around, especially up towards the hip. A lot of people have trigger points and adhesions there. And then once you find that spot, I want you to focus on melting down into it, right? With each breath, each passing moment, you just want to relax more and more into the structure that you're on. And again, the duration, we're gonna hold for 2 to 5 minutes. If you're doing less pressure, so if you're putting more in your arms and your legs, you wanna hold a little bit deeper. And once you find the tight spot, hold there. You can slowly bring some movement by bending and extending the leg. Right. Deep breaths, relaxing through the nervous system. You can hang out there, you can kind of move around. Right, you want to create pressure in the tissue, compression, bring a little bit of movement with that compression, so that way when we get off of it, it's going to direct fluids, blood, cytokines. It's going to start the healing process and just going to hydrate these tissues a little bit more. And you can work your way, stopping at each point that's tender, all the way down to just above your knee. Again, finding the spot, a nice slow movement, right? Again, 2 to 5 minutes, take your time, really settle down into whatever that you're using, right? Let it go, breathe. It might even take longer than 5 minutes. Next, we're gonna get into the other quads. So the other quads is you have your vastus medialis, right? The meaty muscle that forms the teardrop runs from your knee and it connects higher up on your femur. So it's not really gonna get back here. So vastus medialis, because it only connects to the knee, doesn't go all the way up to the hip, it's not gonna have that much influence on the hip. Same thing with lateralis, which is the lateral muscle on the outside. It's actually the biggest quad. It's not gonna have any effect on the hip, just on the knee. So these muscles are important to get into, especially if you have a lot of adhesions or trigger points. But I would say rectus femoris, the muscle we just did, is a little bit more important because it connects to 2 joints. So if you wanted to get into lateral, or if you wanted to get into medialis, and come here. Now here's a key point. You don't want to go too much into the middle of your leg. Once you do that, you're going to get into your adductors. So you might want to turn so your leg's not parallel to the ground, but your foot is a little bit higher than your knee. Right? This might allow you to get a little bit more into medialis and avoid getting into the adductors. And then from here, you can bend, you can straighten, nice and slow. It might get really tender, especially the closer up you get to the knee. The medialis is extremely important for stabilizing the knee. Now in terms of pressure, it's really going to determine what you're using as well as how much pressure you're putting on with your arms and your other leg. So you want to be right around a 6 or a 7 out of 10, right? So if 1 is like a feather and 10 is you're screaming and jumping off, then you want to be right around a 7, 6 or 7, to a point where you're feeling a therapeutic pain, right? You don't want to be guarding. So if it's like too much and you're like gritting your teeth and you're like holding your breath, that's too much. You want it to be a little bit less than that, to the point where it's like, oh yeah, I feel it, but I can hang out here and I can breathe through it, right? So not too much, not too little, find that sweet spot. And again, you can work your way from the knee, not all the way up to the hip, but you can work your way pretty much up towards the hip. Again, not getting into adductors, little tilt to get into that medialis. As for lateralis, the lateral quad, you're gonna bring, again, you can use a foam roller for this, I'm just using the ball, and you're gonna get on the outside of your thigh. The other leg is gonna come out in front. And then from here, again, go ahead, search around. So if you go up and down when you're searching, again, you don't wanna be rolling big rolls, just little small rolls back and forth to find the spot. You can also go side to side, which is cross fiber. You might be able to find some more spots that might feel tight or sticky. And then again, once you find that, breathe into it. You can bring some motion by bending the knee, straightening the leg. Again, 2 to 5 minutes, finding that sweet spot of pressure, that therapeutic pain. And a good indication of whether you should work more on your vastus medialis or your vastus lateralis, your inner quad or your outer quad, is by looking at the knee. So what your medialis does is it pulls your knee towards the midline, right? It pulls your knee this way. Lateralis pulls it the other way. So if you have a knee that's maybe being pulled more medially, then you want to really focus on medialis. If your kneecap is being pulled laterally, then you want to work more on lateralis. There's a simple way that you can find out what needs to be worked on in your body. Next, we're going to get into the adductors, right? The inner thigh. Now, the adductors can cause so many problems at the hips, and there's a lot of different muscles in this area, especially a big one called adductor magnus, which runs all the way from the knee all the way up to the front of the hip. And then as you move up the leg, you begin to have more and more adductors connect like a fan, right? So the adductors connect like a fan as you move up the leg. This can cause a lot of problems at the hip or the knee. A lot of times people have really tight adductors, a lot of adhesions, a lot of bound up fascia. So this will really help get into that. Again, you can use a foam roller or a ball. The ball is really intense, which is why I'm using it. Been doing this for a while. Again, determine how much pressure by how much weight you put in your arms or your leg. From here, just like medialis, when we got into the inner quad, instead of being in this position with the foot higher than the knee, you want to be parallel, right? We want to take that medialis and move it out of the way almost to get into that inner thigh. From here, you can start at the knee. You can kind of search around, dig around, like right there. You can begin to breathe, settle into it, bring some movement into it. Pinning it down and then moving it is what's called a pin and stretch. Really help open up the fascia by bringing some movement and compression together. Right there. Again, chill here. Find those tight spots. Hang out there for 2 to 5 minutes. You can work your way, search around. You know, you might say 2 to 5 minutes. That takes a lot of time. That's time consuming. Trust me, it's worth it. The longer that you go through life and the more traumas that you experience, the more likely that your fascia will become bound up. And the more bound up and dehydrated that your fascia is, the more that your muscles will start to work not as effective as usual. Your movement patterns will begin to become the same, and you will just lose a lot of range of motion, a lot of movement potential, and you may experience a lot of pain. So taking this time to really start to unwind the tissues of the body, open things up, will do a lot of benefits for you for the rest of your life. Let's talk about hamstrings. Before we get into the specific techniques of how to unlock your hamstrings, we need to talk about a concept that is extremely common in the fitness industry, where people will tell you to stretch out your hamstrings, right? Even intuitively, a lot of us will be like, oh, we have tight hamstrings, or I feel this pressure in my hamstrings, let me stretch them out, let me bend over and touch my toes. And for a lot of people, stretching out your hamstrings and over mobilizing them is actually doing you more harm than good. The reason why is because of our lifestyle of always sitting down, we're tending to have more of an anterior pelvic tilt, where you stick your butt back, you lose core engagement, and you rest in your hip flexors in this way, where you're just kind of walking around with your butt sticking back. What does that mean? That means that your hamstrings are already stretched out, right? We talked about that in the beginning of this video. If you're in that anterior pelvic tilt, your hamstrings are already stretched out. Now, a muscle can get stuck concentrically, so it can get stuck when it's short, but it can also get stuck long in that stretched position. So when it's stretched and it's stuck, you're gonna feel that tightness in your hamstrings, which means you're gonna wanna stretch it out. That's gonna be exactly what you don't wanna do because it's already stretched out. So if you're in that anterior pelvic tilt, what you wanna do more is stretch out and inhibit the quads that are pulling the pelvis forward, and you wanna strengthen and shorten the hamstrings a little bit more. If you're in that posterior pelvic tilt where you have that tailbone tucked, then stretch out the hamstrings, do self-myofascial release on them, and that'll help bring your pelvis back to neutral. Other than that, here's the technique for this. Lacrosse ball, right? You got different types, softer, harder. Again, it's up to you and your pain threshold, what you can tolerate. You don't want to guard, you don't want to tighten up, find that sweet spot. You're gonna sit on a hard surface, preferably, and you're gonna take that lacrosse ball, and you got your inner hamstrings, you got your semi-sisters, which are semimembranosus and tendinosus, and your bicep femoris, which is your lateral hamstring. So you can start here on the inner, up by the knee. Go ahead and take that lacrosse ball, kind of play around, kind of move around, find that tender spot if there are any, some trigger points right there. And then from here you can bring some movement there. Right? So if you do have some intense sensation in the back of your legs, if your hamstrings feel tight, but you're in that anterior pelvic tilt, I think it's much more beneficial to actually be doing self-myofascial release in this way rather than just stretching them. Right? Getting into the trigger points, getting into this bound up fascial tissue is going to be much more beneficial than just stretching the tissues. So good. Again, find the sweet spot, straighten out the leg, and then bring it in. Right? You can work your way all the way up. The hamstrings attach from the knee all the way up to the ischial tuberosity or the hips, right to the sitting bone. Again, you can do that working all the way up, and then you can do that on the outer hamstrings, the biceps femoris, starting at where it connects to. You can feel that ligament right on the outside. Again, find some sweet spots. Engage again 2 to 5 minutes. Again, working your way all the way up to your hips. And then once you get to your hips, you can actually find your sitting bone. So you can go ahead and find that bone that you sit on. It's very easy to find on most people. And you want to go just below that. And what you can do is you can get the attachments of the hamstrings by sitting right on that, finding that spot. It might be tight on you. And then from here, you can play around with some more movement. So I'm right under that ischial tuberosity, right under that sitting bone. And again, bring some movement. So what we're doing right now is we're compressing the tissue, and then we're moving the tissue with that compression, which is going to allow the fascia to move, rehydrate itself once we come off the ball. So there you have it, hamstrings, baby. There are so many different areas of the body that many of you may have pain in where you can do some of these self-myofascial techniques and really get a lot of relief and change in your body. If you want to check out other areas of the body, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Stay tuned for those videos. Drop a like, leave a comment with any questions. I'm Coach Zach with Team Criticalbench, and I'll see you next time. Yeah.